Well, good afternoon and welcome back to the program. And we're joined today by Russ Mitchell, who writes for the college football news, FoxSportsScout.com. Russ is kind enough to give us some of his time. Russ, good afternoon. Thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon to you too, Jacob. Hope all's well in the great state of Alabama.
Well, it is. It's well and it's hot. That's for sure.
Well, it's hot everywhere, so it's good to know. It's also, I would imagine, hot, at least will be hot in the Alabama football offices. Nick is not known for relishing in his victories for very long, so no doubt the heat's already turned up to go for 3 in a row.
Well, let's start there, Russ. Alabama, they won the national championship the last 2 years. Everybody knows that. They are going for 3 in a row. The dynasty seems unstoppable right now. Where do you see it going? Do you think they can do it again this year?
Yes, they will do it again this year.
Will.
Actually, you know, I had LSU winning in 2011 before the season, in large part given that defense, which is one of the better defenses, along with Alabama's their first championship under Nick. I thought that was an excellent defense as well. But I had, and then I had Alabama winning last year, and then I have Alabama winning this year. If you look at the team, I mean, the defense, folks are talking about turnover. I see very little turnover. Brandon Ivory, he played behind Williams, but I mean, look at him. He's 6'4", 310. He's got a ton of experience. The whole front seven is all upperclassmen. There's not an underclassman in the front seven for Alabama.
Right.
So a very experienced front seven. And then you look at the back. You've got Sunseri, Clinton Dix, Fulton, Ballou. You've got still Landon Collins. I don't know how you're going to keep Landon Collins off the field. Who are you going to take off, Clinton Dix or Sunseri? And
Yeah.
you know, as we all know, Alabama football under Nick Saban is about defense, and all you need on offense is good rushing and a competent quarterback. And you have great rushing and an exceptionally good quarterback. And then when you look at the schedule, because as we always say, football is just as much about schedules as it is about coaching or rosters. Go talk to Georgia.
Right.
They've benefited greatly. And by the way, we can talk about Georgia's schedule this year because it's also fairly weak, even though LSU rotates onto the schedule. But you look at Alabama's schedule, I mean, it plays out perfectly. Virginia Tech, great problems at Virginia Tech right now. Then they get a bye before A&M and a bye before LSU. Those are the two toughest games. You're playing Tennessee and Kentucky out of the East. So the rich get richer, and I don't see anybody stopping Alabama in the SEC. And if there's no one in the SEC that can stop Alabama, then I don't see anybody outside of the SEC being able to do it.
Well, you talk about the schedule, and what game do you see being the most troublesome? Last year, of course, Texas A&M was kind of unexpected. Everybody thought it would be LSU or someone else.
No, it'll be LSU. LSU will still be the toughest game. I think that the loss to A&M from last season was grossly overplayed, in large part because it sells newspapers. The first half of that game, first of all, everybody struggles in their first quarter the first time they play a team like A&M with a new dynamic head coach. Kingsbury's not there anymore now. Of course, he's off to Texas Tech. He was their offensive coordinator. But that's, Kevin Sumlin's offense, and you're going to struggle the first time you play that, particularly with an amazing athlete like Johnny Manziel. He doesn't look tall, doesn't look big, doesn't look fast, doesn't look athletic, and he's all of them. But that being said, that loss to A&M had as much to do with the fact that in the previous week, Alabama had to go up to Baton Rouge and play for 40 minutes. LSU ran over 80 plays in that game. And Alabama was worn out by the time they had to play A&M the following week, emotionally and physically spent. They have a bye week at the beginning of the season, and they've got their headlights squared right on A&M. So I don't see Alabama having as much trouble. LSU, conversely, I think it's true they lost a lot of redshirt juniors who went off to the NFL. But just like Alabama, there's a whole host of talent underneath, the first line.
Right.
And they'll have, that game's the second week in November. So they'll have a lot of time. They won't be inexperienced by the time they make it down to Tuscaloosa. So I still think, particularly if Zach Mettenberger plays like he did against Alabama in the first, oh my good, I mean, he looked like Tom Brady. I watched Jacob, the video of every throw that he threw in that game, and that kid's got some stones, let me tell you.
Yeah.
He stood in the pocket on almost, I don't think he scrambled once. He took a hit on every blitz.
Yeah.
And had a spectacular game. So, yeah, no, I still think LSU is the toughest opponent on Alabama's schedule.
Yeah, you're right. He did. He had a fantastic game. And if you're going to beat Alabama, which LSU did, except for the last 40 seconds of the game, you have to make those kind of throws. You have to stand in the pocket, and that's exactly what he did. Well, let's move farther west in the SEC West to a school that has a lot going on right now, but is kind of unsure about where they will be this year, and that is Texas A&M. And we've seen Johnny Manziel, of course, won the Heisman and has had all the distractions surrounding him personally. And then you have DeShazer Everett and Floyd Raven, the two defensive backs, being suspended yesterday because of an altercation that occurred in April. Where is this Texas A&M team right now?
Well, suspensions, as we all know, let's wait and see if they turn into missiles. Right now, I still think that this is going to be a very good Texas A&M team, certainly as long as they have Johnny Manziel under center. I can tell you this, I've spent a lot of time with the young man, and he's tiny. And I know I'm bigger than the average person, but, I mean, he's a tiny kid. He's barely 6 feet tall, weighs about 190 pounds. But he is really an amazing athlete. Just some of the stuff he can do is just remarkable. So anytime you're going to go up against him, and he's a threat to run or throw, and he's going to have the ball on every single offensive play, that's going to be daunting. Plus, their offensive line comes back still fairly well intact. They benefited greatly by the fact that Jake Matthews came back for his senior year as opposed to going pro. But I expect that we're going to see a very good A&M team, just like last year. The two wild cards are going to be the middle of the defense, right? They only have one linebacker returning, and they lost their star defensive end.
Right.
So the middle of the defense, and the second issue is going to be how impactful losing Kingsbury to at Texas Tech, the offensive coordinator.
That's a good point. And I saw a quote from Cliff Kingsbury this morning, and he said that he expects Johnny Manziel to be even better. My question to you is, do you think Kevin Sumlin should bring Johnny Manziel here to Hoover? Do you think he ought to bring him with all the distractions?
Well, I mean, the kid's just been a walking distraction. So I think that even the circus that Hoover is, there's a chance that his off season has been even more distracting than Hoover, which is absolutely shocking to think that could be possible, but it might be true.
Well, we have a lot of Auburn fans here to listen to the show, and they want to know how their school's going to do after a 3-9 season last year. Very disappointing for the Auburn Tigers. Of course, they fired Jane Chizik. Now they have Gus Malzahn, basically the same offensive approach they had 2 years ago. So where do you see Auburn this year?
Well, you'll remember midway through the season last year on Paul's show, I said that I thought Auburn would go 0-8 in conference and should be fired. That was the same day that Pat Dye said it would never happen. So unfortunately, I think that it's going to be another hard, long season for the Auburn Tigers. I think State's going to have a harder time, Mississippi State, and we can talk about that later. But I think that I'm still unimpressed with Frazier or Marshall. Mm-hmm. I think that it's clear. Well, first of all, Auburn's not as bad as 0-8 conference. Clearly, they gave up on Chizik throughout the season. But that also says something about the character of these young men. So, it's still the same young men. You can bring in a new coach, and I know we say he's a new coach, but clearly he has a little bit more experience with the Auburn, its players, and the fan base than a quote unquote new coach would, considering he was the offensive coordinator for so long. But you look at the one benefit that Auburn has going for itself is that its schedule actually balances out quite nicely. The hard games are spread You've got LSU in the front, A&M in the middle, and Alabama and Georgia at the end, with quite a lot of space in between, including a bye week between Georgia and Alabama. So, and a bye week after LSU, which will be very important to heal. That game's in Baton Rouge, by the way,
right.
which Auburn has not played very well in Baton Rouge of late. So, at the end of the day, this is an offensive line last year that was unable to block for whoever was under center.
Right.
And I think, you're talking about probably seeing a redshirt freshman playing at a guard position. You've got an inexperienced sophomore, probably Patrick Miller, playing right tackle. So at the end of the day, on offense, I have concerns.
And they have Georgia and Alabama, which I believe I'm right. I don't think that's ever happened before, that they had them both at home in the same season. So a chance maybe if they could, if they get some breaks, they can get an upset.
Auburn is not playing football right now at the same level as Georgia and Alabama. So I think that any team can beat any team in the SEC. We all know that.
Right,
and if Georgia or Auburn have a flat game, if Georgia or Alabama have a flat game on the 16th or the 30th, then Auburn could win. But right now, Auburn is, unless there's dramatic improvement during fall practice and in the first half of the season, and unless everybody really jumps on Malzahn's offense, I think this will be another difficult year.
Well, the other three teams in the West, of course, Arkansas, Mississippi State, and Ole Miss. And I want to key in on Ole Miss. There's a lot of hype surrounding the top recruiting class, depending on which service, top 5, depending on which service you subscribe to, for Hugh Freeze and the Rebels. Well, the question is, Ole Miss, how are they going to fare this year?
I have Ole Miss over Arkansas and Auburn. They were my sleeper team one of my two sleeper teams last year, along with Utah State.
Mm-hmm.
I think that they're going to do very well. The big issue with, if you want to just pick one thing from Mississippi, if you recall, they actually outscored Alabama in the second half of that game last year. I know that the game was already out of hand or close to out of hand, but they outscored Alabama in the second half. They should have beaten Texas A&M. They played LSU very well down in the Bayou. I think it was like a touchdown game, if memory, 41-35 or something.
Yeah, it was
like
very
that.
close.
Yeah, so this is and they were playing with a lot of underclassmen last year, a lot of kids, young kids, and they all come back. They have an excellent pass rush. In fact, I think that you could argue they had a better pass rush last year than Alabama did. The problem is that their back seven was, they had two very good linebackers, but their back seven needs to improve. They really need to improve at cornerback. Probably going to be Golson on the other side of Sawyer. Sawyer's pretty good, but if you can only protect half the field, you might as well protect none of the field. And if Mississippi's got to improve on anything, any unit, it's pass defense. So that's what you want to keep an eye on August the 29th when they play Vanderbilt.
Moving to the SEC East now. Last year, Georgia was able to go through the schedule with one loss before they got to the SEC championship game and came up a few yards and seconds short against Alabama. Is it Georgia again this year, or does Florida make a run, South Carolina?
It's not going to be Georgia. Excuse me, it's not going to be Florida. In fact, I have some serious concerns about Florida, which we can talk about in a sec. But I think it's going to be Georgia. Again, their schedule works out quite favorably. They start off with at Clemson, which doesn't matter. If they lose to Clemson, I still think they'll win it. It's an in-state game down in Atlanta, and I think they match up well. But it's going to be a shootout, that's for sure. But they could lose that game, and it's immaterial. They could still run the table in the SEC
right.
and be at the national championship game. So it basically comes down to South Carolina and LSU. That's it. They play them both in September. Both are in between the hedges. They have a bye week between them. In fact, technically they have two bye weeks because one of those is North Texas.
Right.
So, and then if you look at their 4 road games, Jacob, it's at Tennessee, who went 1-7 in conference last year. At Vandy, who was 5-3. At Auburn, who was 0-8, and at Georgia Tech, who were barely over 500.
Right.
So that's a very easy road slate for Georgia. The big question for Georgia is going to be defense. They've got Grantham coming back after flirting with the Saints. He should have left, in my opinion, because he had all that talent last year, and they struggled on defense. They got a little better as the season went along, although they still gave up 350 yards.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just think about it, if you're giving up 350 yards rushing to a team, then basically you're literally not stopping them at all. I mean, think about it. Alabama, I think, had the ball for about 37 minutes or 38 minutes in that game, ran for 350 yards. And that's the story of this Georgia team. They were not able to stop the run last year. And they might be able to walk through what is a favorable schedule. Remember, they've lost to South Carolina the last 2 years and still made it into the SEC championship game. So they can walk through a fairly favorable schedule, but they'll get rolled by Alabama or LSU in the championship game.
Yeah, I think Georgia fans probably are still having nightmares about that South Carolina game last year in Columbia.
Oh, and by the way, that game should have been 0.
Yeah,
it should have been
right.
37-0. They scored on a drive, Georgia did, at the very end of the game with like 2 minutes to go when South Carolina was playing their third string. So that was actually a shutout, really, in Columbia. And, one of the biggest surprises for me of all of last year was Alabama's performance in that championship game, the SEC championship game, which really was the national title game, in my opinion.
Sure.
I was very disappointed with Alabama's performance in that game. I thought they were sloppy at times, particularly defensively. I actually watched that tape 2 or 3 times. I'll probably go back now that almost all of our 2013 reviews are over and watch it again.
Yeah, you talked about giving up 315 yards on the ground for Georgia. Well, Alabama also had to play sloppy to keep Georgia in the game. Good point.
Do you realize that Gurley, who is the second best running back in college football, behind Carey out at Arizona, and yes, Gurley's a better runner than T.J. Yeldon. That Todd Gurley is a very impressive running back, isn't he? 122 yards, 2 touchdowns in that game, and they were hard yards, man. I'm very impressed with him. It's clear, even though they have Keith Marshall. And by the way, that's the difference for Georgia. That's the difference. The difference is that they've had spotty running back play in terms of actual on the field. I know Isaiah Crowell was good, but he was not a fan in the locker room.
No.
He was a very destructive force. King, before him, they've had several others before running backs over the last 4 or 5 years. They haven't been able to find leadership in the running back core. And now they have 2 good guys, really 1.5, because more emphasis is going to be placed on Gurley. But that's the difference. It helps the offensive line play better, takes pressure off the wide receivers, takes pressure off the quarterback. So, and that's why I see Georgia winning the East again.
You mentioned concerns about Florida. What are those?
Well, where do you want to start? I mean, first of all, the fact do you realize they once again they only have 1 quarterback on their team that's ever taken a snap in college football. That reminds you a little bit of 2011.
It does.
Muschamp's first year when Brantley got hurt, and
they had nowhere to go.
Remember when they sent those 2 young boys out there to Baton Rouge and to let them lose? That, in fact, if I remember correctly, I wrote that Alabama was going to knock Brantley out of the game and the season. I said Brantley will get injured in that game and not be able to play in Baton Rouge. And it did happen. They blitzed him and twisted his ankle, if I remember correctly. And they had to put Driscoll and Brissett on the field in Baton Rouge, and they're looking at the exact same thing. And that's an offensive line that struggled last year to protect Driscoll. They're going to struggle again because he can't decide if he's going to run or throw. I have a lot of doubts about Driscoll still. It's an offensive line that's seeing a lot of change this year. They were saved last year by Mike, the running back, and he's gone now too. So now they've got and they lost 4 of their top 5 wide receivers. So I mean, listen, they're Muschamp recruits well. So just like Alabama and LSU, they've got a bunch of young guys that are very, very talented, and they can bring them up under it. he's been on campus for 2.5 years now, so everybody's familiar with the schemes. But, you know, there's a lot of potential risk at Florida on the offensive side of the ball. And then on defense, they've only got, how many guys are coming back on defense? I have to look it up, but there's not many. So, you know, I have South Carolina over Florida. In 2011, I had Florida going winless in October, which they did, and I think that there's a chance. I don't think that will happen again, but if anything happens to Driscoll at the beginning of the season, they could miss a bowl game. That's how bad that's how tenuous that offensive situation is.
It's amazing. You talk about the recruiting that they do at Florida, and they've always done it, no matter who's the coach. But they continue to get into these low-depth situations. I'm just continually amazed by that.
Well, it's too easy. They have 3 guys returning on defense, 3 starters.
3, right.
On defense. So,
okay.
You know, they're in a situation like, not unlike LSU in, you know, they have a lot of guys who have gone early to the pros, and I know that Alabama has that. It's cyclical, I think. I think that some years there have been some years where Alabama's been hit harder than others. LSU's situation was a little bit unique, and that's why I had LSU winning the championship in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
Do you realize that last year on LSU's defense, of their starting 11 defensive players, 10 of them were in the same recruiting class?
That's amazing.
I've never seen that before. I've never seen that. And the reason why that's interesting is because, you know, you form a special bond with the young men that you come into the same class with. So, you know, that was a very cohesive defense for a number of reasons. But they were all 22, 23-year-old men. They were ready to, you know, move on and make a living.
As we wrap it up here, I want to talk about the Heisman race and the chances the SEC has to get in that, and they have an abundance of those. As you look across the SEC, who are the top contenders, do you think, that for college football's most prestigious award?
Well, if McCarron doesn't get included this year, I'll be furious because you know, the first sophomore to ever lead a team to a national championship, to do it again in a third year, you know, in his junior year, and to have an opportunity to win 3 in a row. And don't kid yourself. I mean, McCarron, let me take a step back. I mean, McCarron's not, you know, he's not Peyton Manning, but, you know, he's a very important cog in the machine. I would say maybe the most important quarterback Alabama's had in 10, 15 years. And if he doesn't get some credit for his ability and his leadership, simply because he plays on a team with a lot of other really great players, I'll be very disappointed. So that's the first thing. Then if you look around the SEC, Jadeveon Clowney has to be included as a defensive player. If Ndamukong Suh, who was one of the greatest players I've ever seen covering this sport for 3 decades, if Ndamukong Suh was included, then Jadeveon Clowney has to be included. And then I would say Gurley. I really like that Gurley kid out of Georgia. He's a very powerful runner, and I think he should be included. And then you're kind of throwing sticks to see, you know, who has good seasons. Maybe if LSU surprises everybody, the low expectations, and if Mettenberger lights it up, he could be included, particularly if they have a big win against Alabama and Tuscaloosa. Maybe someone like T.J. Yeldon, if he really explodes. Although Alabama's become like LSU, they run a lot of running backs, so that tends to take a little bit of the shine off of any one single running back. But that's, and then of course, you know, there's always a chance that Johnny Manziel could beat Alabama and LSU and go to the national championship game and win 2 in a row. Although voters don't like to do that, really. And
then I hear from Georgia fans, too, who talk about Aaron Murray and his chances.
No.
And have we forgotten him?
Stop.
Yeah.
Stop. Listen, Aaron Murray, he's a lovely young man, and he's a good person. But that kid throws more interceptions in big games. Go look at his record in big games. Don't look at In fact, and maybe the Alabama game was a turning point for him, because then he had a fairly decent game against Nebraska, although Nebraska was overrated in the Capital One Bowl, where they came back in the fourth quarter. But if you look at that kid's career, even the Florida game, Georgia hasn't won a signature SEC game for like 5 years until they won that Florida game. And they needed 6 turnovers from Driscoll and company to do it. So, in my opinion, Aaron Murray, he's got a big arm, and he's a nice kid, and he's been playing forever. Like Vinny Sinceri has been playing forever. I can't believe that kid's still in school. But
the Stephen Garcia tour through the SEC.
Yeah, just guys, it's like, that kid hasn't graduated yet. But, he's got happy feet in the pocket. He is good for at least one concentration lapse a game. We're talking about Aaron Murray. Mm-hmm. He throws really bad. He's good for at least, Jacob, 1 turnover per game in every big game that he plays. Don't believe me? Look it up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, you're right. And in the big games,
as opposed to AJ McCarron, who gets none of the credit that Aaron Murray gets, none of the credit, in my opinion, and never throws a turnover. Very rarely has an interception. So, and holds on to the ball well. I mean, let's put it this way: when McCarron loses a ball, people are shocked. When Murray loses a ball, nobody blinks.
That's true.
So it is true, yeah. Not everything I tell you is true, brother.
Yeah.
So, I would be shocked. I would be shocked unless the Alabama game last year and Nebraska were a turning point for Aaron Murray. I will be shocked if he wins the Heisman Trophy.
Russ Mitchell is the lead SEC columnist for the College Football News and FoxSports.com. If you'd like to follow him on Twitter, you can do so. It's at Russ Mitchell CFB. And Russ, great stuff. Outstanding 30 minutes as we look ahead to the SEC season. I'll see you in a couple weeks in Hoover.
See you down in Hoover, Jake.